I'm Oliver Mantell. I'm the Director of Evidence Insight at the Audience Agency. And I, along with my colleague Elise, who will introduce herself in a sec, will be taking you through the key findings of the Cultural Participation Monitor. Now, I imagine many of you will have been to one of the sort of 7 previous waves of the Participation Monitor, but maybe not all of you. So I'll say a little bit in a sec about what the monitor is and sort of what we're looking at and so forth. But first, for the purposes of audio description and noting that there is transcription in the toolbar at the bottom, but to describe myself, I'm a white male with vaguely blonde hair, and I'll pass over to Elise.
Hi everyone, my name is Elise. I'm researcher at the Audience Agency, and for the audio description, I'm a white woman with dark short hair in my late 20s.
Yes, just mentioning age there, just to rub it in slightly. Yes, I'm not in my late 20s, it's probably fair to say, or indeed even my 30s. Anyway, enough of that. What we're going to be taking you through today then is the top line of what we've found in the latest wave of the Cultural Participation Monitor. Specifically, what we're looking at is it's a wide range of things in terms of cultural engagement, of attitudes, what's affecting why and how people are doing things, but we've also zoomed in on a few particular sort of hot topics from the moment. So the monitor itself has been running since October 2020. There have now been 8 waves, as you can see, spaced out in that time, a total of 25,000 surveys, which is a slightly daunting number for a large panel like this, albeit, of course, nothing like the sample we have things like Audience Finder. But what this does that's different is it's about being representative of the whole population. So attenders, non-attenders included, and it's deliberately set up to have proportionate numbers from different bits of the country and different ages, sexes, etc. And audience spectrum types, so different sort of profiles of engagement. So it's looking at the whole population. We've obviously been tracking it on the way through, and we'll show you a couple of things today which show how some of the key indicators have been changing over time. It includes various links to cross-tabs that analyse different aspects of people who are responding in different ways, including audience spectrum, so our way of describing the population. It's supported by the Centre for Cultural Value, but this wave in particular was supported by ALVA, the Association of Leading Visitor Attractions. And so we worked with them to devise some questions specifically about ways in which people support cultural organisations and visitor attractions. And that's one of the areas that we'll be talking about today. We have already done a presentation to ALVA and their members separately. The monitor overall has a whole load of things about engagement of different sorts, online, offline, participatory engagement, people's wider ledger habits, their interests, what are they most sort of concerned by in terms of their activities, but lots of things then about what's driving their attitudes towards engagement at the moment. For a long time, we've been seeing COVID being a really key issue for big chunks of the population. Obviously, the cost of living, we saw in the last wave in September, October, that was a really big issue then, and we've kind of revisited it now to see how that's changing. If you want to see more, there's loads more on the Audience Agency website about the monitor and previous waves, and also various other analysis we've done. So that's the headline. What we're going to be talking about specifically today is a range of broader things about how much people are engaging, why they're engaging, the impact of COVID, the impact of the cost of living, and where we've asked people a bit about their changing booking behaviour, so we can start to get behind what people have been telling us anecdotally, and we have also seen in transactional data through Audience Finder about the ways in which people are booking later, and we'll start to see which groups that's mostly affecting. We asked some questions about how people use social media in terms of arts and cultural organisations. We're unpacking that in more detail at next month's tea break, which we can tell you more about later. But nonetheless, some stuff there about how and why people are using social media. And then these questions that we worked up with ALVA looking at ways in which people support cultural organisations. So that's our kind of menu for today's feast, and I will pass over to Elise to pick up on the first two sections of that. So Elise, over to you.
Thanks, Oliver. Great to be here with you all. Thanks all for logging in and coming to hear more about this new wave of the participation monitor. I'll start by saying this will be my last event with the Audience Agency, so it's a special one for me, but yeah, nice to be ending on such interesting findings, interesting data that I'll talk over with you all, and feel free at any point to put questions in the chat if anything's unclear, either from the data or implications, that sort of thing. So just diving right in, we're going to start by looking at general attendance and reasons for lack of attendance sometimes. So our headline figure here is that 84% of the population modeled by our survey have been to any in-person arts or heritage event in the last 12 months. That is slightly down from wave 7, which was in sort of September time, where it was 90%. However, as a caveat, we did ask the question slightly differently in this wave, which does tend to affect slightly the percentages. So with a slight grain of salt, audience participation seems to be a little bit down, but nothing sort of too major. But what we are seeing is when we ask people, you know, did they feel like they were attending less or more compared to what they did before the pandemic, across the board, roughly a third are saying that they are attending less than they used to. Now that is self-reported. And as you can see on the chart here, it does vary a little bit by age, with sort of lower percentages for younger age groups and higher percentages for the 45 to 64 broad age category. But generally speaking, we're around a third, and every age group is saying they are attending less than they used to, even the younger groups that are attending more than the older groups overall. So this is our sort of starting point, is that, and it probably echoes what a lot of you who are working in the sector have been feeling through observing your own audiences, that there is still a drop, there is still a portion of the audience that has gone missing, so to speak. So we asked a lot in this wave of the monitor about barriers to attendance. And broadly speaking, we saw that cost of living has really become the main barrier. So here you have people answering two statement questions: the rising cost of living putting me off attending cultural events, or the risk of spreading COVID putting me off attending. And those blue sections of the bars show very clearly that cost of living is a much bigger barrier at the moment compared to COVID. And that is sort of the big change that we're seeing happening over the last sort of 6 months compared to last year, certainly. So yeah, 61% are being put off from attending because of the cost of living crisis, whereas it's only 24% for COVID. And we also asked them, not only are they being put off currently, but do they feel like those factors will still affect them in 6 months' time, in a year, in 2 years' time. And here, just looking at how it will affect them in a year's time, we see here again that living will still be the main factor. So on the left here, you have the same chart that was in the previous slide, so 61% being put off attending currently, and 74%, 3/4 of the population, saying that they feel the cost of living crisis will still impact their life in a year's time. So that's a pretty clear picture. However, excuse me, it is still 27% who think COVID will have an impact on their life, and that is a bit higher with older populations. So that is just something to bear in mind if you happen to have an older audience, although there's a lot of other implications to having an older audience at the moment that we've talked a lot about in our events recently and over the last year or so. And absolutely come talk to us if there's something you're struggling with. We've done quite a bit of research into the effect of age on attendance and on current attitudes to attending. And there will be a bit more on that in the rest of the presentation. But so COVID is still overall, it's not completely gone away, even though it's being dwarfed by the cost of living crisis in people's minds and in barriers. In terms of attitudes to COVID, it's something we've been tracking a lot. And the risk of, the perceived risk of catching or spreading COVID has been continuing to drop. And we've seen this in this wave as well. And the next chart here, this is the numbers at the bottom show you the percentages through the different last few waves of the participation monitor. So we had one wave in April, and then one in September, and then the last one in February. And we can see the red line of people who think the risk with COVID in day-to-day life is high or very high. It just continues to drop to now 10% thinking the risk is high or very high, and 51% thinking the risk is low or very low. So even though it is putting off some people attending, overall, the perceived risk continues to drop.
If I can just jump in
Yes.
quickly there, because I think there's something really interesting in those two figures you just cited, and that if it's only 10% who are saying that it's a very high risk of catching or passing on COVID, clearly the rest of that 24% who are saying they're being a bit put off must be being put off presumably for other reasons, or they're put off even though they don't think it's a particular risk, which is kind of interesting. So when people going, well, it's not very risky, but it's still a bit of a barrier.
Exactly. Yeah, the perceived risk is not everything. And it is interesting to note that it doesn't 100% match to decision making about attending or not. And maybe there's more of a correlation between perceived risk being very high or high and those who would, it might be about the agreement, like the scale of agreeing or disagreeing to the previous statements. By the way, the slides will all be shared with you later on, so feel free to go back and look back at them. To barriers to attendance, we also looked at how people's attendance was changing. Not just in overall, are they attending less or attending more, but compared to how well they're doing financially. And again, this is self-reported, whether they feel they are better off financially, worse off financially compared to a year ago. So 48% feel financially worse off than last year. And of that 48%, which is that bottom bar here in the chart, worse off financially, 50 to 51% is rounding rounding errors here, but around half are also attending less. So you have roughly half of the population feeling worse off financially than a year ago, and half of those are attending less than they did a year ago. So that's a pretty stark contrast with the population who are feeling better off financially, or even just same as they did a year ago, where only about a quarter of those two groups are attending less arts and culture. So the correlation here is very strong, and it's a very clear picture. And then when we're looking at then asking them what were the main barriers to attending arts and culture, it was just asked to those red bars, the people who said they were attending less. And interestingly, not necessarily surprisingly, but it's good to have it confirmed through data that those worse off financially, 71% of them, their main barrier was money, of course, whereas the groups that were better off financially or reported being about the same as they used to be, it was mainly due to a change of habit, rather than money was still a concern, but a lot less more, it was a lot less present in their responses, this idea of the main cause being money. So this is just sort of a good summary of splitting up the population between in their financial situation and how this is affecting how they are behaving in terms of attending things in person, arts and culture. And interestingly, the portion who are better off financially were also reporting that some of them, about 20%, were attending less in person because they prefer doing things online now. And that was higher for that more well-off group than the others. So there are a few shifts in terms of digital participation that come into play into this picture. And that is also tied to wealth. Sorry, go ahead.
I jumped in again. I just think the change of habit thing, particularly as it's quite persistent amongst both of those two higher bands, I think is a really interesting one, because it's a real prompt that to get people back attending, it's not just about an event, it's about people kind of setting themselves and their lifestyle and everything else up in a way that means they persist in attending. And that once that's been disrupted, it's, you know, the challenge is to kind of, if you like, rebuild those habits as opposed to just get people to come to a thing. So yeah, I think that's kind of an interesting challenge and topic, and might be something we want to come back to when we're chatting later.
Absolutely, and it also reinforces this idea that it's not just about discounted tickets. It's not the only thing that's going to bring the audience back, and lower sort of cost of attending. It will affect a big part of the audience, but there is still a fairly large chunk of the audience who it will be other factors that will bring them back, or that are their primary concerns at the moment. So then, just to finish on these two elements of COVID versus cost of living, here's just a summary slide about attitudes to COVID at the moment. And it's a lot of text, but you might want to just go back to it in your own time. But generally speaking, we have this 24% who are put off attending because of COVID. And it's similar proportions when we're asking other statement questions, such as, I feel nervous using public transport because of COVID. 27% strongly agree, or 22% still wear a mask indoors for events. But 34% now think the pandemic is effectively over in the UK. And then so that is just sort of in general COVID. We have this sort of a quarter to a third of the population feeling affected. And in comparison, cost of living, we still have these 61% who are put off attending. And these statement questions, perception through statement questions are a lot higher. We're more around 2/3 to 3/4 of the population who are worried about the cost of living and its impact on their lives, planning to do fewer paid for leisure activities or look for free leisure activities. And again, with quite a high numbers thinking that it will still have an impact in their lives in 6 months' time, a year's time, 2 years' time. And the worse off category, worse off financially, seem to be more likely to be 35 to 64-year-olds living outside of London. It's higher also for people who are disabled and people who have children. So those are all elements to keep in mind if it does apply to parts of your audience, or when thinking about who to target those discounted tickets to, or this sort of thing, or where to look for in terms of cost reduction of tickets to bring back audiences. So this is sort of just an overview of these two elements and of the main barriers we're seeing, barriers to attendance. I think we can, unless there's any questions, we can move on. Oh, I just want to address in the comments, you're right, together 2012, 19 plus 6 is 25, not 24. That was just because of a rounding. It was 5.5% and 18.5 rather than 19 plus 6. It's just because of the visualization. But you're right to point it out. I was thinking to point it out and then I forgot to point it out. So in terms of how all of these factors and barriers are affecting engagement behaviors, purchasing behaviors, we asked a few more questions about this in this wave of the monitor that we thought would be interesting to bring to you in these key findings. So the first element, which is addressing something that a lot of you have been reporting to us anecdotally, is about late booking. So we asked how much people agreed with the statement that they tend to book more last minute than they used to do before the pandemic. And we have about 4 in 10 people saying that they are booking later, more last minute. So that's 41% overall. And this varies by spectrum type, for those of you who are familiar with our audience spectrum segments. But generally speaking, we see that experienced seekers and frontline families are higher than the rest. Those are younger, more urban groups. Frontline families tend to be younger, slightly less well-off families who rely on social media a lot for staying in touch and finding information, and that sort of thing. And groups that are notably lower, we have commuterland culturals who, as the name suggests, live in the commuter belts, tend to be a slightly more affluent, and attend quite a lot of arts and culture. So it does vary by segment of the population, but overall there is a general trend for late booking. And it is true for both those who feel better off and worse off. It's not so influenced by financial situation, but it is lower for older groups. So it does tend to, this does suggest that this anecdotal trend that a lot of you have been reporting, there is some foundation in it, and certainly for people are feeling it as well for themselves. And yeah, hopefully we can have a chat later about what this means for you and whether it rings true, and if any of you have found interesting solutions to this issue or ways around it.
Can I just jump in with another thing?
Of course.
Which is just that thing about late booking, because we've looked at the audience finder data and how it's shown change in ticket sales. And we have seen a sort of a skew towards people booking in the last fortnight. But interestingly, the numbers of ticket sales on the day seem to have dropped. So people are booking later, but not absolutely at the last minute. The other thing in terms of it affecting people who are saying they feel better off and they feel worse off is that probably there's different things driving those reasons for booking late in those two scenarios. So one group may feel that they can book more things, and they have the option, and they're not expecting them to sell out, and it's sort of, if you like, it's more opportunity for impulse, whereas the other group may be holding back a bit and being a bit more resistant to spending money, and that might be what's driving the late booking. So kind of same behavior, different drivers.
Yes, very good point. Thank you. Another topic we looked at is what we're calling initiators versus responders. So people who will initiate a cultural outing. I'm the kind of person who likes to organize outings to cultural events for my friends, versus people who are more likely to attend if they're being invited. So this idea of sociability driving attendance or driving barriers to engagement. What we found in the monitor is that 8% of the population fit into this initiators category, the way it was defined. And we're using definitions from research by the American research agency Wolf Brown, who ran this study a few years ago, I believe. And so we are replicating this study to give us comparability, and because it showed some signs of success. So this is why we phrased it and conducted it in this way. So 8% of the population essentially strongly agreed that they are the kind of person who like to organize outings for their friends to cultural events. And 13% of the population strongly agreed to the statement that put them into this responder category. So it seems quite intuitive to think that there are more responders than initiators. That probably maps quite well to people in your own social circles or even yourselves. But then we wanted to look at having those two categories, how it fits into those categories, because it does impact, who is going to attend, who is going to be a key person to drive attendance, because those initiators will then bring more people with them, and that sort of thing. So I'm just going to take us through briefly what who generally fits into these categories, and then later on we'll see how it affects behavior. So in terms of our segments, we have more of these initiators, so the ones who will invite people with them, very strongly in metaculturals and experience seekers. So very urban populations, and tend to be younger, quite affluent, or experience seekers, more maybe students or young professionals, but overall quite engaged, and very strongly those lower engaged segments, so the blue ones to the right, tend to be a lot higher for these responder groups. So they are more likely to attend if they're being invited by someone they know, rather than themselves initiating that outing or just attending on their own. Although, as we'll see in the next slide, it is strongly affected by age. So generally younger people are more likely to be either initiators or responders. They're higher for both. They just are, it's linked to the fact that they do attend more, and they are more active in terms of arts and culture. So naturally that means that they will be more present in both of those categories. Slightly more responders among women than men, but also slightly more initiators. Again, they tend to be more engaged. A lot more of both in family groups, but most interestingly, I think a lot more initiators. So they're they're more likely to be initiating a booking or an outing. Yes. So that is sort of an overview of who falls into those categories, and we'll see a little bit more in a second. We'll see those groups come back, and we'll see how it affects certain types of behavior. I will pass the mic back to Ollie for the next session.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and hopefully you'll jump in the same way I did at various points.
I'll try.
To add in. Okay, so that whole initiator and responder thing, obviously we gave you a bit of a flavour about how those groups are different. We are going to be doing more analysis looking at it in terms of how those categories then relate to some of the other attitudinal things and other behaviours and stuff. So look out for more about them in the future, but just to kind of flag that we're trying to see how that kind of network effect is playing out. And speaking of networks, so social media networks, we are trying to unpack over the next few waves of the monitor a range of different aspects of digital engagement, and engagement hybridity, how on and offline behaviour is kind of interconnected. As a hopefully straightforward first step in that little journey, we've been looking at social media following of arts and cultural organisations, and in particular, who does it and why do they do it. And so the structure of that was we asked people what their full list of potential reasons following social arts and cultural organisations on social media, which of them applied and which of those are the main reasons. So here's what we see. So 37% of people reported following arts and cultural organisations or any arts and cultural organisations on social media. Now, I think we need to be a little bit careful about drawing too many conclusions from that as a headline figure, on the basis that how people choose to define arts and cultural organisations could be pretty broad. That could be them saying they follow Channel 4 on the BBC, or indeed anything else they consider to be arts or cultural. This could be fashion, could be a wide range of other things. Nonetheless, that's the group we're talking about. We then look in more detail about when they say why they're doing it. We do see some big disparities. Again, we get this strong rake by age in terms of much higher levels amongst younger groups. That's obviously about higher social media use, but it's also potentially higher engagement with arts and culture through social media in particular. And again, that's that family group sticking out as well. Families, I guess, we've been seeing higher levels of engagement for families. We're probably seeing higher levels of kind of searching for things to do, how to occupy the kids, that kind of thing. And in one of those figures, which probably, every now and then when you're doing research, a figure jumps out at you and you think, oh dear, that looks strange, better check it. This is not one of those. that women are more likely to be following arts and cultural organisations than men on social media. I think that's we could all have seen that coming. But when we asked people, and this is I think this is a selection of all the reasons we gave. Essentially, these are the main reasons that people responded. And we said, which of these apply at all? Which of these are your main reason for following? To some extent, both of those give a pretty similar picture. So by and large, the ones which are most selected at all are the highest main reason. But the couple of key things that stand out from this, and I think some of this will be obvious to those of you who sort of are doing active marketing on social media for organizations, but I think it is worth emphasizing, and it's worth thinking through the implications of it, which is that when you ask people why they're following arts and cultural organizations, it's not primarily because I want to find out a particular thing to come along to. I'm not looking for the next show, the next exhibition, the details of the opening times, and all that sort of stuff. It's because whatever broad category a particular organization is in, people have a general interest in that category. So they're kind of like, they like dance, so they'll follow a dance company. It's not that they're particularly fans of a particular thing as much, or, same for various other types of activity. So it really is about broad interest, which potentially opens up opportunities for more kind of collaborative, sort of joint accounts, interest-based accounts, which then might feed content relevant that are specific to individual organizations, but that aren't, if you like, kind of leading on, this is all about us, or us a little priority. So general interest sticks out as the highest on this list. Entertainment next. So we're engaging on social because it's a fun thing to do. So they're looking to see what they can get out of the interaction itself, or are you sharing content they like, or they enjoying it as an end in itself. It's not just about a gateway to something else. That's particularly true, and we'll see a couple of splits on this, but it's particularly true of people who are younger and people also groups who are less engaged in terms of cultural engagement. That entertainment becomes more important, which I guess pushes the question of, you're looking to reach newer or younger audiences as opposed to catering to a core audience. Does that mean that entertainment and entertaining content needs to be higher in the mix than stuff that's more specific? So given that that's what people are looking for. Encouraging maybe to note that a fair number of people do follow in order to show support. So there's a kind of like an active endorsement, sort of goodwill there. It's not most people's main reason by any means, although we will see a little bit of difference in that in a second. But yeah, so broadly speaking, it's about general interest, it's about entertainment more than that kind of immediate transactional stuff. We look at it split out by age, so with the youngest category here in the red, and then going up each bar, we can see that a couple of these reasons, and this is the main reason, stick out. So younger people are much more likely to say they're following mainly to show support, which is interesting. Suggests a kind of like quite a value-driven kind of engagement. But on the flip side of that, also much more likely to say they're following for entertainment. So again, that's the thing I mentioned before. That sort of support does link, I think, to this slightly higher figure for general interest in the organisation. So you've got sort of like fans, and then you've got people who are sort of just engaged more broadly. If we look at people who have said they have arts and culture as a main interest of theirs, so we asked people about a few different types of things it could be a main interest. Those who said arts and culture were perhaps unsurprisingly, again, it's the general interest in the topic, so that there's a broad enthusiasm for arts and culture, but that isn't meaning that they are so super informed that they care passionately about one particular organisation they happen to be following. It's more
No.
Right
No,
there?
I think I've made it quiet.
Not entirely. But anyway, we'll see how you get on. So yes, so it is still about that broad interest in the topic. They don't say that it's particularly about following the individual organisation, but they are relatively likely to list that as a kind of one of the many reasons why they might be interested, just not the main one. They're also less likely to list entertainment, so that's that kind of, again, that flip side there, in terms of, are you catering to the existing core audience, or are you catering to a much wider audience? Okay. Here we can see our initiators and responders split out. Unsurprisingly, because both of these groups say that they do engage in arts and cultural attendance. That's why we then asked them the question about being an initiator or respondent. So both of them are relatively more likely to follow arts and cultural organisations on social, but that's particularly true of initiators. You know, they're particularly keen, they're particularly looking for information, looking to be informed. And then when we see the split out of main reasons, sorry, this is a split out of all reasons on the right, we can see the responders are a little bit more likely to be looking at entertainment. The initiators are a little bit more likely to be looking for those things which are about information, what to do, how to go, what to buy, how, you know, the practicalities of doing stuff. So there's a wider range of things they're selecting, but it is all a little bit slightly more geared towards, you know, planning and actively attending. So it's less kind of social media as an end in itself, a little bit more kind of making it that as a way of carrying out that initiator role. So again, depending who you're catering to, may affect how you need to be using that social media. So that's just an initial look on that bit. Do we have any outstanding questions in the chat that I have not spotted on the way through? Like we don't?
Not currently, no.
Okay, in which case I will move on to this next bit, but we can have more of a chance for a chat in a sec. Oh, that's it.
No, that was me.
That was you. Right, okay. So support for organisations. This is kind of quite a broad heading. Essentially, we're looking at three main things: about people having memberships for certain types of organisation, people volunteering for those types of organisation, and people donating. And so sort of these are all sort of grouped together, but obviously there's sort of quite substantial differences between them. So this is all of them sort of overall. We asked people, do you have a membership with museum and galleries, or any of them, any heritage historical organisations, any garden natural organisations, any visitor attractions, etc. So one person could answer yes across multiple of these categories, but if they've got multiple things in one category, it's still only being counted once. So it's kind of like which categories are people engaging with. So what we're seeing here is highest levels of donations for natural organisations, the highest levels of membership for heritage and historical. Now, we did name some particular organisations as prompts in the questions, so people knew to put National Trust in the heritage historical category, as well as the likes of English Heritage. And it's not surprising that those organisations do have, obviously, they're some of the largest membership organisations in the country, so not surprising that that's quite a high figure. Volunteering, so quite a lot of people volunteer for at least something, but it's quite broadly spread. But again, those two categories are kind of coming to the fore in terms of the main ones, which is perhaps unsurprising. So there are lots of, there are more, I guess, volunteering opportunities between those. Maybe worth noting that museums and galleries have relatively higher levels of donation than some of the other categories. But certainly compared to other ways of engaging. But that's, again, probably partly about more individual sites where there's less of an opportunity for a kind of an overall membership package, which is reach out to people in the same way that you can do across broad categories like English Heritage and National Trust, wildlife trusts and so forth. So that's the overall picture. So we've got quite high proportions, 4 in 10 of the population donating or having a membership of some sort, and then about 1 in 7 volunteering. We can then see how those groups are kind of broken down when we start thinking about behaviour relative to memberships since COVID arrived. So just to clarify, the headline here is the memberships. So we're talking about sort of 45% of the population. Although, Elise, can you check that number relative to the previous slide while we're talking? But of all the people who have memberships, 60% of them say they haven't cancelled any memberships since the beginning of COVID. So big chunk of people who still have memberships, always have memberships, none cancelled. And a small group, 13%, who say essentially they've cancelled all their memberships. So they no longer have any memberships that have previously had them since the COVID period. And then we've got this relatively sizable group. Certainly most of those who have cancelled memberships have retained others. So it's not as if people are kind of like, it's not an on-off switch. It's kind of, you know, people are starting to choose between memberships as opposed to cancelling them also. Okay. What we also wanted to know is the current situation in terms of memberships going to hold up? So if we've got relatively strong levels of retention memberships, is that going to persist? And indeed, if they cancelled memberships, is that then gone, or are they going to come back in the future? So for the first of those, when we looked at are people likely to renew their membership when it next comes up, almost half saying they definitely would, another 40-odd% saying that they probably would. So most people, all but about 12% of people are saying that they are likely to renew those memberships that they have. So this is the proportion of membership categories across the whole sample, just to be clear, if that makes sense. So if someone had memberships in heritage organisations, and they had a membership in nature organisations, and they had a membership in visitor attractions, they would be asked about all three of those, and all three of those would go into the total. So really, essentially, it's really high proportions of memberships that look like they're going to be retained. Of those who had cancelled memberships, you might expect quite a strongly flipped picture. People have chosen to cancel, so maybe that is very much an active decision. So maybe they won't have memberships in the future. But in fact, in this instance, we've got almost a quarter of people who cancelled memberships saying, no, I definitely will renew it within a couple of years. It's just not right now. Maybe it's a temporary thing in terms of change of circumstances, or it could be the cost of living. It could be that people know that they're not going to use it immediately. But anyway, so a quarter saying they'll definitely restart, and again, another quite sizable chunk saying they'll probably restart. So again, we're talking about a clear majority, over 60%, saying that they anticipate restarting their membership. The challenge, of course, is it's one thing people having a broad intention to restart. It's another getting that to actually happen. So there's a real kind of marketing challenge there, really, in terms of converting that latent potential into actual engagement. And I mean, I suppose in relation to that, it may be worth considering some of the models that people like, I think, Audible do, where you can pause a membership rather than cancel it, because then it's ready and primed to come back on stream, as opposed to being kind of like you're either in or you're out. And or think of ways of kind of sort of supporting memberships through, or kind of managing to retain people if they do have a temporary hiatus. Anyway, it's still a reasonably high proportion of people. 38% they've cancelled for a reason. They're probably not coming back. But actually, if we look at the size of those overall bubbles, it's not a huge proportion of the overall memberships. Okay. When we asked people, did this impact? What was the main reason for you stopping? COVID and the cost of living both came up as kind of key reasons, and really those were the two main reasons. Interestingly, COVID skewed younger, which is maybe not what we'd have assumed. Cost of living landing on the middle age, those with mortgages that have just jumped in price, etc., is maybe less surprising. But again, we are dealing with relatively small numbers, some of these, so you don't want to lean on them too hard, but just to kind of flag. Of course, COVID, there could be all sorts of different types of disruptions that come with that. It's not necessarily just about sort of age and health. Okay, so that was memberships. Volunteering, we see a sort of a bit of a different picture where it's a much smaller slice of the population who are volunteering in the first place, and there's more kind of variability in the volunteering that's going on. So it's a relatively smaller group who've discontinued all the volunteering they were previously doing. It's a similarly small group who have stopped everything, but there's a relatively bigger group who are having to pick and choose a bit between the types of volunteering they're doing. So again, that's maybe sort of like a distinction worth bearing in mind. But lots of them, as you see down the right, are expecting to come back to volunteering. So with those particular types of organisations, you know, within a year or two, you know, we're talking 3/4 of people who say they will at least probably restart volunteering. Similarly, quite a high proportion saying they'll carry on volunteering if they are still volunteering. So hopefully that means that we're through the worst of the volatility in terms of the impact on some of these areas, and that we will start to see people coming back. But again, there's a retention challenge. There's that. And again, it's a bit of a split between COVID and the cost of living as what's driving it. But, you know, often it's not really either of those things. It could be change of circumstance. So volunteering is one of those things that people often do at intensively at a particular moment in time. So as circumstances change, and maybe people were furloughed for a while, so they couldn't work, so they were volunteering, and then they weren't furloughed, so that they couldn't, or changing jobs and so forth. So we did try to just unpack a little bit more in terms of why people might be changing. For this, we kind of used a question actually about a different subject, but where we could see kind of an analogous set of reasons that were driving behaviours. So when we asked people why they were attending less, so we saw before that not being able to afford it was really important. You know, sort of money is a key factor. There's a whole load of things in the red there, it's about health, but then lots of the other things are about those kind of social factors. It's about loss of habit, it's lots of people to go with, it's general lack of energy, it's things we're just feeling a little bit more difficult in general, caring responsibilities, etc. So a lot of what's driving people's behaviour is about sort of where they're at, socially where they're at, who they're connecting with, and so forth. So again, it's a lot of that kind of social context that is really important for driving behaviours, in the same way that we saw that it's that sort of shift in habit as much as any other one factor that's kind of affecting how people are engaging. So part I guess what we're looking at is how do you rebuild that kind of set of behaviours. This is just splitting out by category to sort of make clear any particular differences. But really, I mean, we're seeing relatively lower proportions wanting to restart volunteering for things like visitor attractions, but there were smaller groups in the first place doing that at all. Higher levels expecting to restart memberships for things like sort of more arts-based organisations in particular. I guess where there's where it's less of a kind of rolling membership, particularly that's linked to maybe some outdoor engagement, which people will often have kept it on all the way through, and more something that's dependent on you actually need to be going at a particular point, and it's probably to an indoor thing. So those are maybe more likely to have been stopped and then restarted, and hence appear in these figures. So people are saying, well, I've had to, I cancelled my membership to the museum because I wasn't really going, but now I can go. So I will think about restarting. I'll have the opportunity. So just a little bit of variety by type of organisation. Okay, so lots of people say that they donated to organisations in the last year, albeit obviously without setting a particular amount. We saw that nature organisations were particularly high for that, but heritage ran pretty high as well. But I guess the key thing from a donation perspective, or from a kind of earned income perspective, is that people are expecting to donate less. So half of people who say they've donated in the last year are saying that they expect to donate this next year than they did previously. And unsurprisingly, that's about lots of those groups who are most hard hit by the cost of living and by general kind of financial constraints overall. So people who are younger, people on lower incomes, those children. There's a slight oddity here as well, which is that families, even if they feel they've got better off, are also more likely to donate less. So that there's sort of a general squeeze on families, and even the better off ones, maybe they're just being a little bit cautious. Might be what's driving it. We end up with a situation where the people who are relatively speaking more likely to donate will tend to be some of those older supporters. The people who are most likely to actually turn up to lots of these organisations are skewing younger. So you might end up with a little bit of a disparity or sort of more of a tension between those two different groups. And that might start creating some questions about, well, do you need to plan things in order to appeal to a donor base, or plan things to an attender base? Is there a bit of attention there? So I don't want to overplay that, but it's something which we might see affecting organisations in situations. Then when we look at who's expecting to reduce the donations they make, again, it's some of those younger groups, it's the experience seekers, it's closed group creativity are relatively high. It's also some of the lower income and lower engaged groups, so up our street and supported communities, albeit that's a pretty small sample. So again, that's that thing I was saying about different groups may be affected in different ways. Because we're seeing bigger drops in engagement by community and cultural home and heritage, but there are fewer of them saying they're going to cut their donation behaviour. So it's a bit of a paradox there. Okay. So, does anyone have any immediate questions in terms of what we've talked about so far? Is there anything I've not picked up in the chat before we start to? Well, we'll share some thoughts about what it all might mean when we put it together, but then see what you think. Yeah, okay, so just checking. There's a bit of a conversation going on there, which it looks like it's happened and it's all clear about friend scheme and memberships and things. Boundaries between supporter members is a bit blurry. I mean, yes, it is. That's a fair comment. Okay, so a few thoughts about what this might all mean when we start to put it all together. So in terms of the key things that are impacting on engagement, it's still there. It's a fifth to a quarter of people who are affected by it. So it's still a live issue. But cost of living clearly is dwarfing it in terms of the spread of the population who are feeling that's affecting their attendance. It also looks like it's going to have a longer term impact as well. So if you like, attention shifted that way, doesn't mean that COVID's disappeared. It is worth thinking though in terms of cost of living, and Elise alluded to this, was that clearly one obvious response to cost of living is go, well, how do we reduce ticket prices? But equally, as organisations with rising costs, you also want to increase revenue. There are still substantial chunks of the population who are feeling better off than they used to be. So it's not the case that it's completely across the board. It's 12%, which, not a huge proportion, but it's not no one. We're talking millions of people across the country who are feeling better off than before COVID. And indeed, for some groups, it's getting up to kind of 1 in 5 are starting to saying they still feel better off than before COVID. So I guess what that suggests is we need to be really careful where we're making assumptions about price sensitivity and or prioritization, etc. As well as, because we've seen this from the box office data, that frequency is dropping more than engagement in terms of the breadth of the overall audience. So that suggests essentially that people are being more choosy, and if people are being more selective in terms of what they're going to, it means you really want to maximize the attractiveness of the thing they're going to, as opposed to just trying to take away barriers, because it needs to be a thing that's worth leaving the house the first time that day in some cases, or traveling, or taking on the potential health implications of traveling out and meeting in crowds, or so forth. So there are more reasons for people not to engage, so it needs to be a bigger positive push in order to engage. Okay. So we saw there's different types of late booking going on. Maybe that we can affect some of that behavior in different ways, whether that's dynamic pricing or it's about kind of offers or subscriptions or ways of kind of encouraging people and encouraging people to encourage others. Because one of the challenges we've got, I guess, is that if you've got people not committing to engage, they're also not committing to commit others to engage. So in a way, you get a bit of a knock on there. So again, it's something to think about. We've talked a bit about the way that it may be possible to re-engage in terms of memberships, volunteering, or whether different approaches could affect that. So that's maybe something to think about. But also where we're seeing on the donation side, bigger drops of potential donations from younger people, greater degree of concern about cost of living and potential financial insecurity among younger people, it may be that some of the standard models, which are involving sort of like upfront commitment of relatively large amounts of money, may be less appealing in those circumstances than things which are more of a drip feed, or you can donate support when you want to, but without a sort of sense that you're signing up for a regular thing. We certainly saw when we're looking at online payment behaviours, etc., where younger groups were less inclined to go for the kind of rolling subscription type model and more inclined to go for the sort of ad hoc, pay what you can, pay what you like, pay for one-off things, etc. So yeah, so that's thing to bear in mind. So we saw different audiences on social media are looking for different things and are therefore want different content. So again, it may be worth being super clear what the social media strategy for a particular platform or a particular audience really is. What is it you're trying to get it to do? Is it about awareness? Is it about conversion? Is it around reach and new audiences? For all of these different things, depending what the priority is, might depend what mix of content would be most appropriate. But clearly we can see that certain audiences are after some different things. We'll unpack all that social media stuff in more detail alongside our head of digital at the next tea break, which is the middle of next month. Look at our website or follow our newsletter for news on that. Looking at where people are sort of projecting into the future, what do we think that new normal starts to look like? And again, that's a question that we've all been looking at over the last couple of years. But potentially, we are seeing scope for memberships and volunteering to return to previous levels. Concern about COVID does appear to be tailing away. I mean, you saw that quite dramatic sort of funnel-shaped chart that Elise shared, where it was down to 10% who thought it was a very high risk. In the present, if that trend continues, clearly then 6 months, a year out, that's really not going to be the driving factor, but cost of living probably is. And that's partly because things like inflation, once it's in, it's in. Once inflation's gone up 10%, even if inflation was 0, things are still 10% more than they were. So inflation coming down doesn't actually flush out the problem that caused it. And of course, there are longer term impacts of people, losing jobs or change jobs or change of circumstances, etc. So cost of living does look like it's going to leave a sort of like more scarring on the audience in terms of the impact, but it's not universal. Some groups are affected more than others, and so really, as ever, is about that kind of to what extent can we really understand what particular audience groups want and what their particular circumstances are, rather than just the top line picture. So that's a few overall thoughts from us. I see reference an interesting comment from John, the House Theatre. I'm seeing some patterns between venues sticking to their ticket prices and valuing the art and getting good turn-ups, and other venues slashing ticket costs, devaluing the show, and getting actually lower audiences. Yeah, that is an interesting challenge. And saying price sensitivity varies with different levels of artistry and performer. if they're already drawing crowds, they're still willing to pay. So yes, it's that premium experience thing that we're talking about. It has, if it's really, it's that selectiveness that people are kind of like cutting from the bottom in terms of the events they might engage with, and it's not necessarily cutting based on price. So we're seeing higher value ticket sales holding up much better than the kind of lower to middle value tickets.